Okay, so previously we had seen a she'ela. A wife is allowed to use her husband's tzedakah money unbeknownst to him, and because she wants to help him fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. And we pretty much established that that was a no-go. Okay, our next she'ela is mi shemat matirim avur mosad shel Torah. Ha'im mutar lo lahagzim or shematrim, excuse me, mi shematrim avur mosad shel Torah. A person is a fundraiser for a Torah institution. Ha'im mutar lo lahagzim b'mispar talmidim. Is he allowed to exaggerate the number of students in the yeshiva? V'ligrom sheyitnu yoter mima shehu nonim ilu yadu et ha'emet, causing people to donate more than they normally would if they knew the truth. That like, what was that line from Get Smart? Do you know at this very moment I have an entire battalion of agents that are surrounding this building? The guy says, no. Would you believe 2 grandmothers and a donkey? Or something to that effect, right? So in other words, you have a small charity, but you play it up, right? And in the course of playing it up, you end up exaggerating the figures. Is that permitted? That's lying. Yeah, well, exaggeration is a form of lying. Okay, yeah, you're right. So the tshuva says as follows: Tshuva yesh lahakdim she'imu dabar lahatrim mi she'eino rotza leteit tzedakah klal. So first of all, let's clarify. The fundraiser is appealing to whom, right? If he's appealing to someone who doesn't want to give charity at all, or if he occasionally gives, but he's very stingy in his giving habits, he says, since if this person were living in an old style community, we would be able to coerce him to give. So perhaps there's room to be lenient, to coerce him in a way that involves not physical coercion, but involves deceit. But because we don't know how much he gives in reality, what right do I have to make that determination? You could give much more than you normally give. So I have a right to deceive you in order to get you to give the amount that you really should give. Well, how am I supposed to know that? How is the fundraiser supposed to come to that calculus without going carefully through this guy's, assets? Ulam imidubar legabi mishanosein meiser kedin elasharotzim sheyitin davka avor matara mesuyamet. But if we're talking about someone who does regularly give tzedakah, he's a philanthropist, but we want to convince him to give more to our cause. So there it's clear that it's an Isser Gezel, right? Because of Geneva Stas. You're actually, Geneva Stas is deception. You're lying to the person, and it's a very serious crime. And therefore, in a situation that would come up in a real world situation, where virtually everyone is giving tzedakah properly, asr lahagzim b'mispar talmidim v'ligrom sheyitnu yoser la'osi yeshiva mimasha hayunostim ilu yodu es. It's usher to exaggerate the number of students that are studying in the yeshiva out of an objective to get people to give more than they would normally give had they known the truth. Now, it's really quite interesting. I find this all the time. A person will tell you, oh, we just started a website and we've already gotten 30,000 hits on our website, right? And that's easy to deceive, right? Because 30,000 websites, about 29,950 of them were from bots, And so like, it's when you say I got that many hits on our website, it's a meaningless thing in many situations. So you have to be careful about that, especially with new technologies as well. Well, because it's for a mitzvah, and I'm giving you a zuchus because you get to give to our yeshiva. But you're the kind of person you only want to give to the major leagues. You don't want to give to the minor leagues. Right? So I have to convince you that my yeshiva is a major league yeshiva as well. But, I know that if you would give to this yeshiva, you would get a lot of zuchus and shemayim. So, yeah.
$100,000 for food for a year shows I think that it's outright lying. So
Yeah, even if yeah.
I still only sell great place. What's wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying it's
nothing wrong with saying it's a great place.
It's a hospital place. It ranks blah blah blah. The line.
Okay. Well, the background on the below the line, he says, "Hine b'sefer Chasidim kasav zelashono, ma'isa bi'ish echad shehaya talmid chacham, v'lo hayatzarach labrios." There was once a story about a man who was a talmid chacham and was not financially dependent on charity. However, v'haya holech v'omer tenuli ki ani tzarich, v'lo hayanene shavapruta mima shenosnim lo. What he would do, he would go travel around from town to town, asking for people to support him personally, to help him for tzedakah. But he never touched the money, but rather what? Ki hayanosem la'aniyim tzadikim shekeshayu osam aniyim holchim u'mevakshim lo hayu nosnim v'lo hayu chosheshim. He says he would instead give it to poor people who, because of their lower status, they didn't represent, like he was a Talmud Chacham, so he walked around with the frock and the hat, and he had a reputation of being a great Torah scholar. So he collected tzedakah and said, it's for me. But in reality, he gave it to poor people instead. Now that's a very noble thing to do, right? You would think, right? So, and he had tried originally to collect on behalf of Aniyim that were not him, but people weren't giving. So Omer Tanuli can eat tzarech hayunostim lo. So therefore, when he tried a different tack, and he said, "Give it, it's for me. I need the money. I need the parnasa," the people would give him. V'hayanosein la'aniyim ki amar mutav shani mevayish atzmi v'omer shani chaser kedei she'achaya et ha'aniyim ad kam l'shana. And he said, I'd rather embarrass myself and make myself out as a pauper so that I can support the poor. So you'd say, you hear it, right? But he's lying, right? So because he's a noble liar, it's okay,
I don't think it's the same level, but it's still not.
It's not straight at all. So
there's a little bit of a bend.
That's right. So he says, and Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, this is being written in the 13th century. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid apparently is praising this person for his noble activity. So you see how subtle it can be, right?
I know. You don't see any difference just on the surface?
And he's being completely selfless,
and
right?
People giving stoka, they should know where it's going. It's going anyways. Now what's happening?
So which one is what you're trying to judge is which one is better? They're both wrong.
Okay. So he says, "V'lichaora." He says, based on what I've just quoted you from Sefer Chasidim, yesh mikan heter lahotzi tzedakah ba'arama. Shaharei medubar sheilu yadu shahayu mishaker Lo hayunostim lo ki lo ratzu lo seis lanim. It sounds like from the story that had they known the truth, that he was collecting on behalf of other aniyim, not himself, they wouldn't have given him. Ela sheyesh lidchot shekan haya mutar kevin shelo ratzu latet laaniyim klalo v'nosaf haya bazem mishum atzalas nefashos. He says the way to argue and say that this case is different, right? Because we all sense that there's a difference here. Number one, they wouldn't have given these aniyim at all. And the guy feels, I got to save them because otherwise they're going to die in the streets of malnutrition. So I got to do something. Okay, it's hatzalas nefashos. V'lochein hayomuter lachuf ba'aram et ha'ashirim l'seis tzedakah kevin shlo yeh efsharut acheret. So therefore, I know that there are people who can support these poor people. It's just, it doesn't have the cachet, the appeal to these people because they're not supporting anyone important within society. So I'll say it's for me. I know that I'm a chashuva yid and people will want to give me. And because otherwise I'm not going to find any other way to support these poor people. V'tzarech lahosif shegam la'achar she'osam ashim nasnu tzedakah hayaborer la'oso talmud chacham shehem hayurechokim imilui chayvasam ki asu lachufa me'ever lachofasam. And you have to also argue, in order to make this defensible, that this particular Talmud Chacham who's collecting knew that the Ashirim could afford it and that they hadn't fulfilled their proper quota for giving tzedakah, because otherwise, how can you deceive someone to get them to give more than what their normal quota would be for tzedakah? So you have to say that those two things are present in this scenario for Hasidim to endorse it. Number one, it was Hatzalas Nefashos. Like, how are we going to support these poor people? They're going to die. Number two, the rich people, or the people of means in our community, are not giving their proper due. So that's the basis for making this argument. Ulam, he says, however, Hami'iri Kosa v'zelashonam. Shekol she'enu tzarech lalitzdaka eno roi lo litol mimena b'shum panim. He says the Meiri adds to this idea, and he says if a person doesn't need tzedakah and he's collecting it, he's not allowed to take from the tzedakah chest under any circumstances. Mikol makom im hayosim kain lekavana sheyizku bala acherim afal pi she'en das hanosnim bekach rishayin ad kam l'shana. If, however, a person accepts tzedakah with the intention of giving it to other poor people, even if the donors are not aware that he's just a middleman for the recipients, it's permissible. In other words, I would be allowed to, let's say, Rabbi Karapkin would go around and say, tzedakah, tzedakah. People will say, Rabbi, he collecting for it. One of my kids really needs it. Can you help me out? So, and I'm collecting. People say, for sure, I'll give the Rav of the shul. Why wouldn't I give the Rav of the shul, right? So, and then I turn around and I give it to a family that is not popular in the community, and their kid needs the tuition paid, right? So I'm misrepresenting the truth. The Meiri seems to say that that would be acceptable. Now, you could appreciate how the circumstances of whether it passes the smell test or not could change so easily dependent upon the circumstances. Well, what if the reason people don't want to give this guy is because he was involved in the Ponzi scheme in Lakewood that was just in the news? I don't know if you saw that. You didn't see the news story? Oh my gosh. Just look up Lakewood Ponzi. Yeah. And you get a whole bunch of stuff comes up. Unfortunately, it's a guy that was sitting in jail, was pardoned by Trump, and now was back at it. Yeah. So
It's also the 13th century.
Meiri is, I believe, either 14th or 15th century. Yeah. You also, I mean, the Sefer, he's arguing even more. You have to be able to argue that it's Hatzalas Nefashos. Impossible. Impossible. Impossible to know what else he's given. That's right. Or his kids. Yeah. 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 There's no way to know.
So really, what are we saying here? Is it possible to make it correct, or is it not possible?
Well, he just quoted from the Meiri, who says that I don't need tzedakah, but I'm allowed to go around collecting, representing that it's for myself in order to be able to get it to people who truly need it. Which, well, it's a very terse comment from the Meiri in his commentary to the Gemara in Masechah Shkolim, or the Mishnah in Masechah Shkolim. Lefi zeh b'nidon dinan lichora muter lahagzim legabe nispar talmidim kevan Choshen kein bekavana lezakos lacher. So therefore, look, I'm the fundraiser for the yeshiva. Let's talk about a guy who doesn't get any percentage, any cut from the yeshiva. He goes around, takes off his summer. Let's say he's a rebbe in the yeshiva. He already has a salary. And he decides that over his summer, he's going to volunteer to travel to Chutz La'aretz and to fundraise for the yeshiva. Every penny except for his plane ticket will go to the yeshiva. He's not taking any of it at all. And he wants to convince people to give. So he says, have you heard of Panovich? My yeshiva could rival Panovich, right? Have you heard of the Mir? My yeshiva rivals the Mir. The quality of guys, it's incredible. The way they learn, and how many Talmidim do we have? Hundreds and hundreds. Okay, all right. So he's putting on a good spiel. But he says V'yesh litchos shedivrei hameiri mitzdamtzimim la'ofen shemeduber begemara sham dahainu ba'asher she'omer shehu ani. He says, however, you could say that you cannot extrapolate from that statement from the Meiri, because the Meiri in that Gemara is commenting on a piece of Gemara that talks about there was a wealthy person who claimed that he was poor so that people would give him tzedakah. And he's collecting on behalf of people who come from good families who are embarrassed to collect themselves. So, in other words, in a situation like that, he says, "Shadavka banim b'nei toivim shemizbayishim litol v'ilu hayu mevakshim ba'atzim hayu nostim lahem." He says maybe the Meiri is talking about a case where the people who really need the tzedakah are too embarrassed to ask for it themselves, but if they would have asked for it themselves, people would have given them. So, in other words, he is being deceptive, but the end is the same, because the people who are giving don't care whether it goes to him or whether it goes to the real poor. It's just that the only way that he can get these people to give is to claim that he is poor. He says, and therefore you could make the argument that even if they knew the truth, they would be happy to give up the money. All right, and that's the reason why it's not gezel. Yeah, that's right. So what's the argument to justify lying? Because it's not gezel, because these people would give anyway, and I'm only lying in order to protect the embarrassment from people who, let's say, their last name is a very famous name in the community, and they're too embarrassed to ask on their own behalf that people should give them.
If the hearer did not reasonably rely on what you said, so if they're going to do it anyway, you're not liable. You're not influencing them.
So what's an example in the secular law case?
So it would be the same thing, puffery in a contract or something like that, or say, buying shares because you're going to become $100,000 wealthier or whatever. In my opinion, is the best deal ever or whatever. And they don't rely on that. I say, I don't really go for that, but I hear what you're saying. I'm gonna buy it anyway.
But you'd have to be able to demonstrate that
Yeah.
the person was not relying on it.
Yeah, or there was no reason, objectively, a reason to buy it.
Right.
So far-fetched or something.
Right. So that's the concept of asmachta that we've talked about before, right? V'nechlal begimel dvarim shemuter l'shanos hamuvarim b'bava mitzi, and it's therefore included in the category of three things for which you're permitted to lie. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says that there are certain situations where you're permitted to lie in order to avoid embarrassment. Let's say, like a person says, "Oh, that's not my bed," right? Because there's a big stain on the bed. Well, you're saying it to avoid embarrassment, right? Um, uh, those are the kinds of situations where you're allowed to lie, the Gemara says, in order to avoid embarrassment to yourself or to others. Okay. Then he says another argument. Va'od ra'isi b'sefer maseh hatzdaka lahagon Rav Eliyahu Peretz Shlita. I don't know who this is. You'll have to forgive me. Shehevi raya l'mi shehiter lahagzim lagabi misper talmidim mehad demuter lagabi lilvos mikupa shel tzedaka v'lomar she'ein kesef bekupa kedei sheyitnu l'tzedaka. He says there is a halacha that's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that it is permitted for a gabbai tzedakah to borrow money from the community tzedakah chest, and then to tell people that we've depleted the funds from the tzedakah account in order to incentivize people to give. Zelushono, as the Shulchan Aruch writes in Siman Reishon and Tes, Hana'a la'aniyim bi'ikov hamos biyad hagabai kidei la'asos la'cherem litain harei hagabai muter lilvosom l'leporim ad kamoshana. So here's a deceptive practice.
Just here, finished mortgage many years ago. Don't tell you that. Because if you tell people that your mortgage is paid off in the shul, they're not going to give you money. Oh, the shul's got to have a mortgage. So it wasn't lying saying we didn't have a mortgage, just not to say it, not to be forthcoming with information, which is
Right.
not, which,
Right, but here
right,
that's just by passivity. Here,
outright.
this is outright. The Gabbai Tzedakah is saying, and he's not lying, by the way. He's saying the funds are the community fund is empty.
And it is.
Now it is empty. Why? Because he took out all the money. Now he's gonna pay it back, right? But this is right. So we should take a look. We should take a look.
Offer to give the bicycle to the temple as a gift, and then you want to buy the bike back because all of a sudden decide that you really need it. Wasn't there a percentage you had to pay on top of the cost of the bike to get it back from the temple?
Oh yeah, that's called hektish, right? When you make something hektish and you want to redeem it back, you have to add 20 or 25% back in order to redeem it back. But that's a special case of hektish that doesn't apply to stam tzedakah, right? Yeah, that's specifically temple property. It's a good argument though. Let's just take a quick look at this in the Aruch HaShulchan. Let's see how the Aruch HaShulchan views this halacha in Reishon and Tes. Two 59. Okay, so Just see. Sorry. He says like this. He's talking about he's talking about the Gaboim having a right to borrow the money. Oh, okay. So let's talk about this. When are you allowed to change the tzedakah funds from one tzedakah to another? We talked about this before. Kodem shaba liyad gabai, before it comes into the hands of the gabai. Aval achar shaba, let me just share the screen, people who can't see it. Aval achar shaba asela liyad gabai, asur l'shanosa, lo hanosein v'lo hagabai v'chol shken acher. But once it's given to the gabai tzedakah, the collector, you're not allowed to change it to a different tzedakah cause. He says, "V'lo mitam kedusha that tzedakah eno hektish, ela mitam tekvar zachu bo hanim." And the reason is because it's as if once it's come into the hands of the collector, it's as if it came into the hands of the aniyim themselves. He says, "Me'ata." So pshita the most shalacherim ein la'acher rishus lishnamis b'hem below rishus haba'olim, and you can't use someone else's money for your own purposes. So va'afilu hagabai sheyado kiyada mikol makom miyemer shenosnu rishus alzeh lahalvosu lachlifa. And even the Gabbai tzedakah himself doesn't have a right to use it for other purposes or to borrow the money for personal use. But if we could make the argument that the aniyim benefit from the Gabbai taking the money out of the fund and borrowing it, because by doing so he can claim that the fund is empty and then get people to give more. He says then he'd be allowed to borrow from that fund or to lend out the money to others and then to get it to be paid back. Because then we assume that the aniyim would be happy with this. And therefore the Gabbai, if his tzedakah fund is collected for nondescript purposes, he's allowed to change the funds for whatever purpose he wishes to do. And if indeed the Gabbai uses the tzedakah fund as a gemach to lend people money, that's perfectly legitimate. So the Aruch HaShulchan really doesn't represent or doesn't really discuss the deception aspect of it. He says, and therefore he quotes from the Taz, he says, Ulam yesh lefakfek al rayaso sharei b'tzei. So in other words, there's a sefer called Maaseh HaTzedakah that argues that it would be permitted to exaggerate the number of students you have in the yeshiva based on this Shulchan Aruch, who says that the Gabbai is allowed to deplete the fund deliberately, even though he knows it's going to be replenished because he's lent out the money, in order to be able to get people to give more money to the fund. It's a deceptive practice, right? Because maybe he didn't have to deplete the fund, but he did it in order to be able to create a new campaign so that there'll be more money for aniyim. He says, Ulam yesh lefakbek al rayaso, but the raya is not such a great raya, and we'll cover this in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. We'll hold it here.